Allegorical representations of justice tend to have three attributes: the scales, the sword, and the blindfold. The blindfold symbolizes that justice is neutral, that it somehow stands outside of or above politics and ideology. But the other two attributes, in many ways, symbolize a political process. The scales weighing up different arguments, different points of view, carefully considering and contemplating them. On the other hand, the sword as the force that's required to enforce the decisions that have been made. The relationship between these two elements is quite problematic. Violence, force is required to implement just decisions, but it also has the potential to overwhelm the process of careful consideration and contemplation. How can we tame the violence that's required for the exercise of justice? How can we make sure that violence doesn't overpower the very thing that we're trying to achieve? Today I'm in the Giannucci Art Gallery on the University of Nottingham's campus, which is currently showing an exhibition called In the Shadow of War. These artworks here will help us cast our mind back to a historical moment where these problems around justice came into particularly sharp focus. It is 1945, the end of the bloodiest conflict the world had ever seen. Civilians had become targets, legitimate targets, on an unprecedented scale. Think about the aerial bombardments of cities, the nuclear bombs dropped in Japan, and of course the Holocaust, where millions of Jews were murdered in Nazi concentration camps. The Allies were fighting a war against the barbarism of the Nazi dictatorship and its allies in the name of justice. To cast it as a just war, a war in the name and the defense of morality and civilization against barbarism, was to lift it above politics, to make it stand seemingly outside ideology, to make its cause universal and thus uniting. If we look at the sculpture here, Henry Moore's Falling Warrior, we see some echoes of this. We see the mobilization of a universal, timeless language. The warrior does not wear a uniform, he does not hold a gun. He holds a shield, which might be an ancient Greek shield, alluding to a long-standing pictorial tradition of the falling warrior. But at the same time, this statue also, I think, casts some doubts on this easy line of continuity. Think about how it makes you feel, your emotional response to these kinds of forms. The proportions are odd, the limbs are contorted, they're fragile, they're almost childlike, they're very vulnerable. And I think this casts some doubt about the association between justice and violence. It doesn't affirm violence as a means or vehicle for executing justice. Elizabeth Frink's bird is similarly disconcerting. It's a bird of prey, traditionally the symbol of martial virtue and national greatness. Think only of the American eagle. But this bird is not triumphant. It seems itself afflicted by the violence that it brings and perpetrates. Its wings have fallen off, its body seems to be literally falling to pieces. Perhaps the statue casts some doubt on the collapsing boundaries between victors and losers, between victims and perpetrators. We can trace this problem well beyond the realms of high art. This part of the exhibition is dedicated to the remarkable photographs of Lee Miller. Lee Miller was a professional art and fashion photographer who, during the war, became the war correspondent for the French magazine Vogue. The 4 photos I want to look at with you today are images she created in that role when she documented the liberation of the concentration camps at Buchenwald and Dachau in 1945. Lee Miller's images break many taboos, but her representations of Nazi perpetrators are particularly interesting. This photograph shows the office of a Nazi mayor which has been ransacked by Allied soldiers. It could be seen as representing the triumph of justice, the disintegration of the Nazi world order which the mayor represented. But it's also an uncomfortable image. The sheer physicality of the traces of violence here sit uneasily with our imagination of justice as a process that restores order and harmony in the world. Or take this image. We see a victim, and our immediate instinctive reaction is pity. It's only when we look at the caption that informs us that the victim is actually an SS guard who's committed suicide that our instinctive reaction is challenged. Are we still to feel pity once we know of the heinous crimes that this individual has committed? And is violence committed in a just cause, therefore always just? This image shows another perpetrator who's brutally beaten by his former victims, the liberated inmates of the Buchenwald camp. So is this image morally straightforward? In some senses, yes. Some of us may have doubts about the efficacy of killing civilians who may or may not have supported a brutal dictatorship, or soldiers who may just have been following orders having been drafted into the army. But it's easy to see the perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust as unequivocal incarnations of pure evil. And yet this image also raises a different question. When does retaliatory justice cease to be just? How do we negotiate that transition from the just war to the justice of the post-war world, to the justice of peace? This, the final image I want to discuss with you today, shows another Nazi perpetrator. He's been imprisoned and is awaiting trial. So this could be seen as signifying that transition back from the association of violence and justice in war to a peaceful understanding of justice that becomes the business of the courtroom, a process that culminated in the big war crimes trials of the post-war decades in Germany. But the perpetrator here gives a defiant Hitler salute. So how are we to react in a situation where the victors have handed back justice to the courtroom, have made it a matter of peace, but the perpetrators refuse to let go of their ideological allegiance to the brutally violent regime that created and sanctioned their crimes in the first place? How are we to pacify justice if the perpetrators so blatantly refute it? These photographs raise difficult questions, not just because of what they document, but also by how they work as images, the way in which they affect our emotional responses. Images are very important to the way in which we think and feel about politics, but they may both reveal and obscure messages that are not contained in the text. They may not be aligned with the caption, with the background information we have about the political situation at stake. This week we'll be debating, in the learning steps that follow, the relationship between violence and justice. When is violence an appropriate means for the implementation of justice, either on the part of a state or perhaps some other political actors, even individuals? And does that inevitably spark then a cycle of violence and retaliation that becomes difficult to translate back into peaceful exercise of justice? We look forward to debating these questions with you.